Wasn't. Joining us now is TalkTV's international editor, Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome, Isabel. Doesn't it get on your nerves when people apologise for really good jokes?
Honestly, it's the first thing that's made me smile all day.
Exactly.
I don't think he needed to apologise for that. You know, perhaps Matt Hancock should have been sacked to save lives and protect the NHS, because what they did may have saved a few lives, but it certainly didn't protect the NHS. And ultimately, when the NHS is on its knees, as it is now, thanks to COVID, that costs many, many lives, as we now know. So I think Mark Sedwell's expression in his private WhatsApp was quite reasonable, actually.
I mean, Priti Patel, to me, seems to be making an extraordinary remark there in the clip that we played, essentially saying that, well, you know, I was told that shutting the borders wouldn't do anything to stop the spread of this disease. You know, never mind the fact it's a communicable disease in another country. Let's just keep flights coming in from that country. It seems to be whistling in the wind by suggesting that that was a common sense approach to not do that. But during those early stages of COVID, indeed throughout COVID, where did the buck stop when it came to these decisions? Was it Priti Patel who decided on matters such as closing borders? Was it Matt Hancock who decided on matters when it came to the hospitals? Was there this, a chorus of voices and a community decision-making process? Because it's very hard to discern when you're watching this inquiry where the buck stopped at any particular point.
Well, guess what? They didn't know either. So I can tell you from having read the private WhatsApp messages, including those between Matt Hancock and the then Home Secretary Priti Patel at the time, that there was a great deal of exasperation that actually within government, no particular individual or agency or indeed department is actually in charge of borders. I mean, just let's hold on to that thought for a moment. Just think of the significance of that. So at that time of national crisis, no one was actually in charge of our borders. They all had little bits to do with them. So, for example, the Transport Secretary has a bit of a locus on borders. The Home Secretary has a bit of a locus. The Health Secretary obviously had an interest in it, but nobody was in charge of gripping what we did about the borders. And you're right, it's of course common sense that if you've got a dreadful plague coming, and it's coming primarily from China, although by the time we knew about it, it was coming from all sorts of other places as well, then in the short term, it probably makes sense not to allow a whole load of people to come in from those places where the virus has been seeded. But you can take that policy way too far, as we saw with New Zealand, which effectively became a hermit kingdom for the best part of 2 years. So there's a balance to be struck there. And I think this could be an interesting finding of the inquiry. You know, to what extent should we have used our island status in the very early days of the pandemic to minimize the number of deaths and stop the spread in the short term while we worked out what it was we were dealing with? I think a policy of shutting ourselves off from the rest of the world longer term would have been an even greater catastrophe than the succession of lockdowns that we actually did embrace.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So no one in particular is in charge of the borders.
Well, they're still not.
No change there then.
Right,
Also, let's talk about your friend Matt Hancock, whose shenanigans you brilliantly revealed in your WhatsApp files exclusive, one of the great stories of the year. I don't expect a Christmas card from him, by the way. But to go back to Mark Sedwell and the real reason he wanted, apart from saving lives and protecting the NHS, the real reason he wanted Hancock fired was because he thought his communications lacked candour. That's civil service code for he's a barefaced liar. He also went on to call Boris's administration as brutal and useless. I mean, there's a real image of dysfunction here. You've got these civil servants dealing with a government they think is useless. You've got the cabinet ministers who think the civil servants are hopeless and are holding them back. Once again, a picture of governmental dysfunction in our greatest crisis since the Second World War. Not very encouraging, I don't think.
I mean, it's quite hard to imagine any recent administration doing this any better, because I'm sorry to say this is an entirely representative picture of what the inside of politics is like. You remember that some people may remember the old series, The Thick of It. I mean, it is just that comical, except when there are many, many millions of lives being affected, there's actually nothing funny about it whatsoever. What I have found quite striking from the evidence to the COVID inquiry this week and last week is the extent to which Boris Johnson was up against an impossible force when he tried to inject some different perspective into this debate. You know, his instincts were that we should not keep locking down again and again and again once we knew that this was a virus that was only likely to prove fatal to a very small number of people that were not very elderly, a small number of vulnerable people with underlying health conditions, the very obese and the very elderly. His instinct, once we knew that, which we knew pretty early on, was actually you should go for a different type of protection for those people and let the rest of the nation get on with it. But he had no hope whatsoever of implementing that policy because the entire forces of the civil service and the number 10 machine and all the rest of them were against that policy. And unfortunately, he simply did not have that leadership, that strength of leadership of his great hero, Winston Churchill, to stand up against these people, if you like, to face them down. And I personally think, many will disagree, that had he done that, the collateral damage from the pandemic, response to the pandemic, rather than the pandemic itself, would be much, much less than it is today.
Unless Mark Sebel was warned that Boris's administration were a pack of wild, feral animals. Let's remind ourselves of Mr. Sebel yesterday.
I think anyway,
PM and the people he chooses to surround himself with are basically feral. You say,
oh, right.
I've got the bite marks.
Yeah. Well, that's
Who are those people?
Well, as you will see, Mr. Keith, there is sometimes some gallows humour in some of these WhatsApps. I think so. That first exchange came after a point where there'd been very severe friction between me and the Prime Minister and his immediate team.
I mean, one thing that Boris Johnson has dined out on a lot since leaving number 10 is the fact that we were the first country to get vaccines in arms. Well, we're now seeing that AstraZeneca, the vaccine that was essentially backed by the government and the first one to be injected in this country and in the world, are now facing lawsuits to the tune of £18 million because of injuries and even fatalities caused by the vaccine. Do you think that there was too much bravado on pushing this thing out into the nation before there was enough duty and tests done to make sure that it was safe?
Alex, thank you for raising that. I think that's worth a whole other programme. There is a lot in the WhatsApps about the vaccines, the vaccine policy, the way the checks went through, the unprecedented speed at which everything was done. To be clear, the vast majority of people suffered no ill effects, certainly none that we know of. The vast majority of people did fine on the vaccine, and I am sure that it saved many lives. But the reality is that people were heavily pressured into taking vaccines. Many of those people probably did not need those vaccines. And I think we have to have a very honest and sober appraisal of how all of that was handled and the extent to which politics and egos and fear and hubris actually had to compete with health concerns when it came to the decisions that were taken about how many of these vaccines to procure, how fast to do them, and how much they should be pushed on the population, and particularly on younger people for whom the cost-benefit analysis and the risk may well not have been justified in the cold light of day.
Yeah, Isabel, thank you so much for coming on the programme. I mean, it wasn't bad. At least we didn't go as far as some countries, did we, in saying, well, you can't go to a coffee shop unless you've got a vaccine passport. Certainly countries like France imposed policies like that. Pretty dystopian stuff, in my opinion.
I agree. Matt Hancock, if he didn't get fired, he'd have had us probably locked in our own bathrooms for the rest of our lives. That was the problem, I think. Now